The hospital board meeting had gone past midnight, and Preston Anders still felt the knot in his chest that had been tightening for months. His physician had been blunt during his last checkup: reduce stress or face serious consequences. At 42, Preston had built Anders Medical Solutions into a healthcare technology empire worth over $2 billion, revolutionizing patient care systems across North America. The cost had been his sleep, his peace, and apparently his cardiovascular health. When his assistant mentioned a meditation retreat in the mountains of Colorado, Preston had laughed it off. 3 weeks later, after another sleepless night spent reviewing acquisition documents, he found himself booking a spot. The Rocky Mountain Meditation Center sat nestled among pine trees, accessible only by a winding dirt road that made Preston question every decision that had led him here. He drove his Mercedes SUV carefully, aware that his usual controlled environment was rapidly disappearing. The main building was constructed from honey-colored wood and stone, designed to blend seamlessly with the natural surroundings. Preston grabbed his single suitcase, suddenly aware of how ridiculous he must look in his tailored wool coat and Italian leather shoes. A woman emerged from the main entrance as he approached. She wore simple gray yoga pants and a loose cream sweater, her dark blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Despite the casual clothing, she moved with an inherent grace that made Preston pause mid-step. She was perhaps in her early 30s, with clear hazel eyes that seemed to assess him without judgment. "You must be Preston Anders," she said, extending her hand. "I'm Grace Calloway. I'll be your primary instructor during your stay." Her handshake was firm, confident. Preston noticed calluses on her palms, the hands of someone who worked with them, not just behind a desk like his own. "I have to admit, I'm not sure what I'm doing here," Preston said, surprising himself with his honesty. Grace's lips curved into a small smile. "That's actually the best mindset to start with. Come inside. We'll get you settled before the evening session." The center accommodated only 12 guests at a time, Grace explained as she led him through corridors that smelled of cedar and something herbal he couldn't identify. His room was sparse but comfortable, with a bed, a small desk, and large windows overlooking a valley filled with aspens. No television, no mini-bar, just silence and the view. "We eat dinner at 6, Grace said from the doorway. "The evening meditation session starts at 7:30. It's optional for your first night if you need to settle in, but I'd recommend attending." "I'll be there," Preston heard himself say. She nodded, studying him for a moment. "Try to let go of whatever you think this should be. That's the first step." After she left, Preston sat on the bed and felt the quiet press in around him. In his normal life, silence was something to be filled, a void that needed conference calls or podcasts or the television playing in the background. Here, it demanded attention. He unpacked mechanically, then stood at the window watching shadows lengthen across the valley until his watch showed 5:45. Dinner was served family style in a dining room where 12 places were set at a long wooden table. Preston found himself seated across from an elderly couple from New Mexico and next to a young woman who introduced herself as a schoolteacher from Vermont. Grace sat at the head of the table, guiding conversation with gentle questions that never felt intrusive. She asked about people's journeys to the center, their first impressions of the mountains, what they hoped to see on the surrounding trails. She never asked about jobs or accomplishments, Preston noticed. The usual cocktail party questions that allowed him to establish his status were absent. The food was simple and vegetarian, but better than Preston expected. Some kind of curry with roasted vegetables, fresh bread, a salad with herbs he suspected came from somewhere on the property. He found himself actually tasting it rather than eating while mentally reviewing spreadsheets. "This is your first retreat?" the elderly man, Robert, asked him. "That obvious," Preston replied. Robert chuckled. "You've checked your watch 4 times since we sat down. Don't worry, by day 3 you'll stop counting the minutes." Grace's eyes met his across the table, a flicker of amusement there. "Everyone comes here running from something or towards something. Both are valid starting points. What made you become a meditation instructor?" the school teacher asked Grace. Preston found himself leaning forward slightly, curious despite himself. "I was a corporate lawyer," Grace said, and Preston's eyebrows rose. "New York, high-rise office, 80-hour weeks. I was good at it, or at least good at billing hours and winning cases. Then I started having panic attacks so severe I'd lock myself in bathroom stalls during depositions." She spoke matter-of-factly, without shame. "I took a leave of absence, came to a place like this, and realized I'd spent 10 years of my life in a state of constant fight or flight. I went back, finished out my cases, and quit. Trained in mindfulness-based stress reduction, studied with teachers in India and Thailand, and eventually started teaching." "Do you miss it?" Preston asked. "The law," Grace considered the question seriously. "I miss the intellectual challenge sometimes, but I don't miss the person I was becoming. There's a difference between pushing yourself to grow and pushing yourself to break." Her words lodged somewhere in Preston's chest, uncomfortable and true. The meditation hall was a circular room with floor-to-ceiling windows on one side, looking out at the now dark forest. Cushions were arranged in a circle, and soft lighting created pools of warmth without being harsh. Preston chose a cushion and attempted to sit cross-legged, immediately feeling the protest in his hips and lower back. Grace moved around the circle, helping people adjust their positions. When she reached Preston, she knelt beside him. "You're holding a lot of tension in your shoulders," she said softly. "Let them drop." "They are dropped," Preston said. Grace's hand touched his shoulder blade lightly, and he suddenly felt how high and tight he was holding himself. "Try this," she said, demonstrating a slight adjustment to his posture. Her touch was professional but warm, and Preston found himself hyper-aware of the contact. Once everyone was settled, Grace took her place in the circle. She didn't sit on a raised platform or set herself apart. Just another person in the circle, though clearly the guide. "We'll start with a simple breathing meditation," she said, her voice taking on a quality that was both relaxed and focused. "The goal isn't to clear your mind or stop thinking. That's impossible and not useful. The goal is to notice what your mind does without getting swept away by it." For the next 30 minutes, Grace guided them through the practice. Preston's mind raced constantly. He thought about the product launch scheduled for next month, the potential merger with a Canadian firm, whether his assistant had remembered to send those files to the board. But periodically, Grace's voice would call him back. "Notice that you've wandered. That's not a failure. That's the practice. Gently return your attention to your breath." By the end of the session, Preston felt both frustrated and oddly calmer. His body ached from sitting still, but the knot in his chest had loosened slightly. "How was it?" Grace asked as people began to leave. "Harder than running a board meeting," Preston admitted. She laughed, a genuine sound that transformed her face from serene to vibrant. "Most people find that. Your mind is used to running at full speed all the time. Asking it to slow down is like asking a marathon runner to suddenly do Tai Chi. Same body, completely different skill set. How long before it gets easier? Depends on how willing you are to be uncomfortable," Grace said. "Some people fight the process the whole time, others surrender into it." "I'm not great at surrendering," Preston said. "I gathered that." Grace tilted her head, studying him. But you're here, which means part of you knows something needs to change. Over the next few days, Preston fell into the rhythm of the retreat. Morning meditation at 6, followed by breakfast. Then a mindful movement session that was nothing like the aggressive workouts he did at his gym in Seattle, but left him surprisingly sweaty and aware of muscles he'd forgotten existed. Lunch. Afternoon free time, which he initially tried to fill with work emails until Grace caught him on the second day. "We have a policy," she said, appearing beside him on the deck where he sat with his phone. "No devices except in your room, and even then, we recommend limiting use to an hour per day maximum." "I run a company," Preston protested. "I can't just disappear." "You told your team you'd be unreachable for 2 weeks," Grace said calmly. "I know because we require it for all guests." "So they're managing without you right now. The question is whether you trust them to do that." Preston opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. She was right, and it irritated him. "What am I supposed to do with all the empty time?" he asked. "That's what you're here to figure out." Grace settled into the chair next to him, uninvited but somehow not intrusive. "When was the last time you were bored?" "I'm never bored. There's always something that needs attention." "Exactly. You've structured your life so there's never space for anything unexpected to emerge. Boredom is where creativity lives, where actual rest happens. But you have to tolerate the discomfort of it first." Preston looked at her, this woman who had given up partnership track at a law firm to sit in the mountains teaching people to breathe. "Don't you ever worry you're wasting your potential?" "I used to," Grace said. "Then I realized I was defining potential by someone else's metrics. Society's, my parents', my own ego. Now I define it differently." She stood, preparing to leave. "There's a trail that starts behind the kitchen. It's about a 2-mile loop. Good for walking meditation or just walking. I'd recommend it for your afternoon." She left him there with his phone, not confiscating it or lecturing further. Preston sat for another 10 minutes then, feeling rebellious and not entirely sure against what. He pocketed the phone and went to find the trail. The path wound through pine forest and alongside a creek that chattered over smooth stones. Preston walked quickly at first, his usual city pace, then gradually slowed as the trail demanded attention. Roots crossed the path, rocks jutted up, and the altitude at this elevation meant his breath came harder. By the time he completed the loop, almost an hour had passed, and he'd spent at least half of it not thinking about work at all. That evening's meditation session focused on body awareness. Grace guided them through a systematic scan of physical sensations, and Preston discovered he'd been unconsciously clenching his jaw, tensing his abdomen, holding his breath shallow and high in his chest. When Grace instructed them to soften these areas, he felt almost dizzy from the sudden influx of oxygen and relaxation. "You're making progress," Grace said after the session. Most others had left, but Preston had stayed on his cushion, not quite ready to move. "It doesn't feel like progress. I feel like I'm noticing all the ways I'm screwed up." Grace sat back down, crossing her legs with enviable ease. "That's exactly what progress looks like in this practice. You're becoming aware of patterns that were running unconsciously. That's the first step to changing them." "Were you like this?" Preston asked. "When you first started?" "Worse," Grace said. "I fought it so hard I actually left my first retreat after 3 days. Told myself it was nonsense, that I didn't have time for this, that I was fine. Then I had a panic attack so bad in court that I blacked out. Woke up in the hospital with my body forcing me to listen since I wouldn't do it voluntarily. That must have been terrifying. It was, also humbling. Also, ultimately, the best thing that could have happened." Grace's expression was soft in the dim lighting. "The universe whispers first, then speaks, then shouts, then hits you with a brick. I needed the brick. My doctor's at the shouting phase, Preston admitted. Then you're ahead of where I was. Grace smiled. The fact that you're here means you're listening. On the 5th day, Grace introduced walking meditation in silence. The group of 12 moved slowly around the property, each step deliberate and noticed. Preston found it almost unbearable at first, the slowness of it, the inability to chat or distract himself. But gradually, he began to notice things he'd missed before. The way light filtered through the pine needles, the variation in bird songs, the exact moment when the morning chill gave way to warmth. Grace walked nearby, and Preston found his attention drawn to her repeatedly. The way she moved with complete presence, each step placed with care but without being precious about it. She'd stop occasionally to examine something, a particular leaf or rock formation, giving it full attention before moving on. There was something magnetic about someone who inhabited their body and the present moment so completely. After the walking meditation, Preston approached her as others dispersed toward the dining hall for lunch. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Of course." "How do you decide what's ambition versus what's just running away from yourself?" Grace considered the question as they walked slowly toward the building. "That's the right question. I think ambition that's healthy feels like moving towards something that aligns with your values and your authentic self. It energizes you even when it's hard. Ambition that's unhealthy feels like running on a treadmill that keeps speeding up, and you're terrified of what happens if you step off. What if you've built your entire life on the treadmill version? Then you have a choice, Grace said simply. You can keep running, or you can step off and deal with whatever you've been avoiding. Easy as that, Preston said, unable to keep the edge from his voice. Grace stopped walking and turned to face him. "I didn't say easy, I said simple. There's a difference. Simple just means uncomplicated to understand. It doesn't mean uncomplicated to do." Preston held her gaze, struck by the directness in her eyes. She didn't flinch from difficulty or try to soften hard truths. It was refreshing and unnerving in equal measure. "Sorry," he said. "I'm not usually this much of a mess." "You're not a mess," Grace said. "You're a human being paying attention to yourself for maybe the first time in years. That takes courage." Something in Preston's chest cracked open slightly at her words. He'd been braced for judgment, for her to confirm his fears that he'd wasted years chasing the wrong things. Instead, she offered simple recognition. "Thank you," he managed. Grace's smile was gentle. "Come on. Lunch is mushroom soup today, and it's really good." The next few days passed in a rhythm that Preston's body began to anticipate. Wake before the alarm, morning meditation, breakfast where he started actually conversing with the other guests, learning about their lives and struggles. Mindful movement, free time that he increasingly spent hiking rather than checking email, afternoon meditation, dinner, evening meditation, sleep that came deeper and earlier than it had in years, and through it all, Grace was a constant, steady presence. She taught with a combination of warmth and precision, never letting people off the hook when they made excuses, but also never pushing beyond what they could handle. Preston noticed the way she remembered details about each guest, asking Robert about his grandchildren, or checking in with the schoolteacher about a difficulty she'd mentioned days earlier. Grace carried a quality of spacious attention, as if she had all the time in the world for whoever was in front of her. Preston caught himself watching for her during free time, learning her patterns. She usually spent afternoons in the garden behind the kitchen, tending to the herbs and vegetables grown there. One day, driven by impulse more than plan, he wandered that direction. Grace was kneeling in the dirt, transplanting seedlings with focus and care. She'd changed from her teaching clothes into old jeans with holes in the knees and a faded blue t-shirt. Her hair was coming loose from its tie, and there was a smudge of soil on her cheek. She looked about 25 and completely at peace. "Want to help?" she asked without looking up. "I don't know anything about gardening." "Perfect. I'll teach you." Grace gestured to a flat of seedlings beside her. "These are tomatoes. They need to go in that bed over there about 18 inches apart." Preston knelt beside her, immediately feeling awkward and oversized among the delicate plants. Grace handed him a trowel and demonstrated how to dig the hole, remove the seedling from its container without damaging roots, settle it in place. "Gardening is meditation in action," she said as they worked side by side. "You have to be present with each plant, pay attention to what you're doing, but also trust the process and let go of trying to control everything." "Let me guess, there's a metaphor here," Preston said, but he was smiling. Grace laughed. "Always. But also, sometimes a tomato is just a tomato, and getting your hands dirty is good for the soul." They worked in companionable silence for a while. Preston found himself relaxing into the simple, repetitive task. Dig, plant, tamp down soil, water. His mind still wandered, but without the usual anxiety attached to his thoughts. "What made you choose healthcare technology?" Grace asked after a while. Preston sat back on his heels, surprised by the question. Most people asked about his success or his company's valuation, not about the why behind it. "My younger sister died when I was 20, he said, the words coming more easily than expected. "Emily. She had a rare autoimmune condition, and there was a medication that could have helped, but there was a clerical error in her records. Wrong dosage prescribed, and by the time anyone caught it, the damage was done." He paused, hands still buried in the dirt. "I was preemed at the time, thinking I'd become a doctor. After she died, I realized the problem wasn't just medical knowledge. It was systems. The way information moved or didn't move, how many points of failure existed in a simple medication order." Grace had stopped planting and was listening with her full attention. "So I switched to computer science and business," Preston continued. "Built software that was supposed to make sure what happened to Emily couldn't happen to anyone else. And it worked. Our systems have probably saved thousands of lives at this point." He laughed without humor. "Turns out you can solve a problem and still be running from it at the same time." "Oh, Preston," Grace said softly. There was such compassion in her voice that Preston felt his throat tighten. "You channeled your grief into something meaningful. That's not nothing. But I also built my whole identity around it. Became obsessed with solving every problem, preventing every failure. Which is impossible, but I keep trying anyway, and that's where the stress comes from. I'm trying to make the world perfect enough that I never lose anyone again." The words hung in the air between them. Preston was shocked he'd said them out loud, that he'd articulated something he'd barely admitted to himself. Grace reached over and placed her dirt-covered hand on his. "You can't prevent loss, you know that intellectually." "But I can't stop trying," Preston said, "even though it's killing me." "No," Grace said firmly, "you can stop trying. You're choosing not to because it feels like stopping would mean Emily's death didn't matter or that you're failing her somehow. But Preston, she wouldn't want this for you. I didn't know your sister, but I'd bet anything she wouldn't want you destroying yourself in her name." Preston's eyes burned. He'd cried exactly once after Emily died at her funeral, then locked it away and poured everything into action. Now, kneeling in a garden in Colorado with a woman he'd known for less than 2 weeks, he felt the grief rise up fresh and sharp. "I miss her," he said, voice cracking. "I still miss her every single day." "Of course you do," Grace said. "That's love. It doesn't go away, but you can carry it differently." They stayed there in the garden, hands still touching, until Preston regained his composure. When he finally looked up, Grace's eyes were bright with unshed tears of her own. "Thank you," Preston said, "for listening, for not telling me to just move on or get over it." "Those are the least helpful things anyone can say," Grace said. "Grief needs to be witnessed and honored, not rushed through." She squeezed his hand once before releasing it. "Come on, let's finish these tomatoes. They'll still grow even though we're sad, and there's something reassuring about that." They planted in silence for another hour, but it was a different quality of silence now. Intimate, connected. When they finally stood, backs aching and hands filthy, Preston felt lighter than he had in months, maybe years. That evening, during meditation, Preston found his mind returning again and again to Grace. Not just her words in the garden, though those had cracked something open in him, but the woman herself, the way she inhabited her life with such intentionality and grace. The laugh that burst out of her unselfconsciously, the dirt under her fingernails, and the sophisticated legal mind beneath the meditation teacher exterior. She was a study in contradictions that somehow all made perfect sense. He was attracted to her. Preston admitted this to himself as he sat on his cushion, supposedly focusing on his breath. Deeply, problematically attracted. Not just physically, though he'd noticed the way her body moved, the curve of her neck, the capable strength in her hands. But attracted to her presence, her way of being in the world, the person she'd chosen to become. This was complicated. She was his teacher in a sense. He was here for 2 weeks, then would return to Seattle and his empire. They lived completely different lives in every way that mattered. And yet, after the session, Grace approached him. "Walk with me." They stepped outside into the cool mountain night. The sky was absurdly full of stars, the kind of sky Preston never saw in the city. "I wanted to check in about this afternoon," Grace said as they walked a path lit by small ground lights. "That was vulnerable sharing on your part. How are you feeling?" "Surprisingly okay," Preston said. "Raw but okay. Like I lanced something that needed to be lanced." Grace nodded. "Grief is like that sometimes. We carry it around trying to be strong and it just festers. But when we let it out, let someone witness it, it transforms into something we can actually work with." They walked in silence for a moment. Preston was intensely aware of her beside him, the small space between their arms as they moved. "Can I ask you something?" Preston said. "And you can tell me if it's inappropriate." "Okay," Grace said, her tone careful. "Is there someone in your life, a partner, I mean?" The question came out more awkwardly than Preston intended. Grace was quiet for several steps. "No, there was a few years ago, another teacher. It didn't work out. We wanted different things, different futures." She glanced at him. "Why do you ask?" Preston stopped walking and Grace stopped too, turning to face him. In the dim light, her face was all shadows and soft edges. "Because I find myself thinking about you," Preston said. "In ways that probably break some kind of retreat etiquette or something. And I needed to know if I should shut that down immediately because you're with someone." Grace's expression was unreadable. "You're not breaking any rules. You're an adult. I'm an adult and you're a guest, not a student in any formal sense. But Preston, you're in the middle of a pretty intense process. Sometimes feelings arise during meditation retreats that are more about the vulnerability of the work than actual connection." "I'm aware of that," Preston said. "I've done enough therapy to know about transference and projection, but I don't think that's what this is, or at least not all of it." He ran a hand through his hair, frustrated with his inability to articulate what he was feeling. "You're remarkable. The way you listen, the way you've built a life that actually aligns with who you are, the way you called me on my nonsense in the garden today but with compassion. I'm drawn to that. To you." Grace was silent for a long moment and Preston braced himself for gentle rejection. "I feel it too," she finally said, so quietly he almost missed it. I've been trying not to, because it's messy and complicated and you're leaving in a week. But I'd be lying if I said I haven't been aware of you, that I haven't been looking forward to our conversations. Preston's heart kicked hard against his ribs. So what do we do with that? I don't know, Grace admitted. Nothing, probably. Let you finish your retreat, go back to your life, and chalk this up to a moment out of time. Is that what you want? What I want and what's wise aren't always the same thing, Grace said, but she hadn't moved away. If anything, she'd shifted slightly closer. Preston could smell her shampoo, something herbal and clean. Could see the pulse beating in her throat. It would be so easy to close the distance between them, to kiss her and deal with the consequences later. But something held him back. Maybe the meditation was working after all, giving him just enough space between impulse and action to choose differently. I'm not going to kiss you, Preston said. Even though I want to. Because you're right that it's complicated, and I respect you too much to make this harder than it needs to be. Grace's smile was tinged with something that might have been disappointment or relief, or both. Thank you for that, and for being honest about how you feel. They started walking again, back toward the main building. At the door, Grace paused. Preston, whatever happens or doesn't happen between us, I want you to know that what you shared today in the garden matters. The work you're doing here matters. Don't lose sight of that. I won't, Preston promised. He lay awake for a long time that night, mind racing despite the meditation practice. The smart thing would be to maintain distance for the rest of his stay, to treat Grace purely as his instructor and nothing more. But the thought of pulling back, of pretending he didn't feel what he felt, seemed like a betrayal of the very presence and honesty he was here to cultivate. The next morning, Grace maintained her professional warmth during the meditation session, but Preston caught her eyes on him several times with an expression that matched his own confused longing. During free time, he hiked alone, needing to think. The trail took him higher than he'd gone before, to a rocky outcrop with a view of multiple mountain ranges stretching to the horizon. Preston sat on a sun-warmed boulder and pulled out the phone he'd barely touched in days. He had 17 missed calls from his COO, 30-plus emails marked urgent, and several texts asking when he'd be reachable. The company hadn't imploded without him. In fact, from what he could gather from skimming messages, they'd handled several significant issues without his input. They didn't actually need him as much as he'd convinced himself they did. The realization was both freeing and terrifying. If his value wasn't in being indispensable, in working himself to death to prevent every problem, then who was he? What was he worth? He thought about Emily, about the conversation with Grace. His sister had been funny, bright, endlessly curious about people. She'd planned to be a social worker, wanted to help kids in foster care. Her death had been a tragedy, but Preston suddenly wondered if the greater tragedy was how he'd let it define him, how he'd narrowed his entire life down to one mission of preventing similar tragedies through better systems. Emily had lived broadly, loved freely, embraced messiness and uncertainty. Preston had done the opposite in her name, and he suspected she would have hated that. He typed out a message to his COO. Taking the full 2 weeks as planned. You're doing great. Trust the team. See you when I'm back. Then, before he could second-guess himself, he put the phone on airplane mode and tucked it away. When he returned to the center, Grace was leading a group through Tai Chi movements on the lawn. Preston stood at a distance, watching. She moved like water, each gesture flowing into the next, her whole being focused on the practice, but somehow also open and aware. As if she felt his gaze, she turned her head slightly and their eyes met across the space. She didn't smile, but something passed between them, an acknowledgement of the current that ran beneath their surface interactions. At dinner, Preston found himself seated next to Grace for the first time. Their elbows brushed as they ate, and neither moved away. The conversation around the table flowed easily, but Preston was hyper-aware of every small contact, every moment when Grace's attention turned his way. "You seem different today," Robert observed from across the table. "More settled." "I think I'm finally starting to get it," Preston said. "Or at least get that I don't have to get everything." Grace's lips curved in approval. "That's actually the entire teaching right there. Everything else is just elaboration on that theme." After dinner, as others dispersed toward the meditation hall or their rooms, Grace touched Preston's arm lightly. "Want to see something?" He followed her away from the main buildings, down a path he hadn't explored before. They walked for perhaps 10 minutes in comfortable silence, until the forest opened onto a small clearing where a creek widened into a pool. The water was crystal clear, reflecting the early evening sky. "This is my favorite spot on the property," Grace said, settling onto a flat rock by the water's edge. "I come here when I need to think or when the weight of holding space for others gets heavy." Preston sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders touched. "Does it get heavy?" "You always seem so composed." "Teaching presence doesn't mean having presence every moment," Grace said. "I have my struggles, my difficult days. I just have more tools now for working with them." She picked up a pebble and tossed it into the pool, watching the ripples expand. "Today has been hard. I keep trying to talk myself out of feeling what I feel for you, and it's not working." Preston's breath caught. "Why talk yourself out of it?" "Because it's inconvenient. Because you're here for a few more days and then gone. Because I've built a life that works, and letting someone in, especially someone whose life is as different from mine as yours is, feels risky." "All valid reasons," Preston acknowledged. "Can I offer a counterpoint, please? What if the risk is worth it? What if the fact that this feels significant despite all the logical reasons it shouldn't is actually information worth paying attention to?" Preston turned to face her more fully. "I came here to learn how to be more present, to stop running from difficult feelings. And now I'm sitting next to someone I'm genuinely falling for, and every instinct says to be cautious and protect myself, and not make things messy. But maybe messy is exactly what I need." Grace looked at him with those clear hazel eyes, and Preston saw the moment she made her decision. She leaned in and kissed him softly, tentatively, giving him every chance to pull back. Instead, Preston cupped her face with his hand and kissed her back, pouring all the longing and confusion and genuine affection he felt into the connection. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard. Grace's hand rested on Preston's chest, right over his racing heart. "Okay," she said. "Okay, we're doing this. But I need you to understand that I'm scared. I don't do things halfway, and I'm already in deeper than is probably smart." "I'm scared too," Preston admitted. "I'm terrified, actually. But I'm also more alive right now than I've felt in years, and I don't think that's a coincidence." They stayed by the pool as the light faded, talking about everything and nothing. Grace told him about growing up in Oregon, about her complicated relationship with her parents, who still didn't really understand why she'd left law. Preston talked about building his company from nothing, about the loneliness of success, about how he dated occasionally, but never let anyone truly close because that would mean admitting he wasn't entirely in control. "I need you to know something," Preston said, as stars began to emerge overhead. "I meant what I said about not doing things halfway either. I'm not looking for a retreat romance that ends when I drive away. I want to figure out how this could actually work. You live in Seattle. You run a company. I live here in the mountains and teach meditation," Grace pointed out. "How does that work?" "I don't know yet," Preston said honestly. But I have resources and flexibility that most people don't, and maybe it's time I use them for something that actually matters to my life rather than just my bottom line. Grace studied him in the dimness. Don't make promises you're not sure you can keep. I'd rather have honesty than pretty words. Then, honestly, here's what I know, Preston said. I have 5 days left here. I want to spend them getting to know you better without pretending this is just a teaching relationship. Then I'll go back to Seattle and we'll figure out whether this thing between us has legs in the real world. I'll visit. You can visit me. We'll talk and video chat and see if what we feel here translates to there. And if it does, we'll figure out the logistics. And if it doesn't translate? Grace asked quietly. Then at least we tried. At least we were brave enough to see what this could be. Grace was quiet for a long moment, then nodded. Okay, 5 days of not pretending, then we figure out the rest. They kissed again, longer and deeper this time, and Preston felt like he was falling through space without fear of where he'd land. The next 5 days unfolded like a dream Preston was afraid to wake from. He still attended the meditation sessions and meals with the full group, but Grace no longer pretended that Preston was just another guest. They would catch each other's eyes across the meditation hall and share small smiles. During afternoon free time, they hiked together, hands linked, talking about anything and everything. Grace showed him how to identify different bird calls, how to move quietly through the forest, how to simply sit with nature without needing to do anything. Preston told her about the pressure of being responsible for hundreds of employees, the weight of investor expectations, the way success had become a treadmill he couldn't step off. With Grace, he could voice doubts and fears without being judged or having her try to fix him. I've been thinking about your question from the garden, Preston said one afternoon as they sat beside a waterfall. About healthy ambition versus running away. I think I need to restructure how I run the company. How so? I have an incredible COO, Anna, who's been with me almost from the start. She's as capable as I am, maybe more so in some ways. But I've never fully empowered her because that would mean giving up control. What if I actually stepped back? Transition to more of a chairman role and let her run day-to-day operations. Is that what you want? Grace asked. Or is that you trying to fit into what you think I want? Preston considered the question seriously. It's what I want, or what I'm starting to want. I built the company to solve a problem and honor Emily's memory. It's done that. It's successful beyond anything I imagined. But I'm not actually needed in the trenches anymore, and staying there is ego more than necessity. I could consult on strategy, guide the vision, but have time for other things. A life that isn't just work. What would you do with that time? Grace asked, but she was smiling. Well, I'd like to spend a fair amount of it getting to know this meditation teacher I met, Preston said, pulling her closer. Maybe learn how to cook something other than scrambled eggs. Read books that aren't business related. I used to love photography before I got too busy. Maybe pick that up again. That sounds nice, Grace said softly. It sounds like a life instead of just an existence. On Preston's last evening at the retreat, Grace arranged a private dinner for the two of them in the garden where they'd first really talked. She'd set up a small table with candles, and the meal was simple but perfect: grilled fish, roasted vegetables, fresh bread, wine. I wasn't sure I should be sad or happy that tomorrow's your last day, Grace said as they ate, but I've decided on happy. Because this has been extraordinary and I'm grateful for it regardless of what comes next. What do you want to come next? Preston asked. Not what's logical or practical. What do you actually want? Grace set down her fork and met his eyes directly. I want you to go back to Seattle and figure out who you are when you're not running from grief. I want to keep teaching here and tending my garden and living the life I've built. And I want to find a way for those two things to coexist with us being together. Because, Preston, I'm in love with you. I know it's fast and maybe crazy, but it's true. Preston felt like the air had been knocked from his lungs. I love you too. I didn't think I was capable of feeling this way, or maybe I was just too scared to let myself. But Grace, you've reminded me what it feels like to be fully alive. They kissed across the table, knocking over a wine glass neither of them cared about. When they finally pulled apart, both were laughing and crying at the same time. Come to Seattle in 2 weeks, Preston said. Give me time to get home, have some hard conversations, make some changes. Then come visit, see my world, meet my people, and let's find out if this can work in real life. I'll come, Grace promised. But Preston, don't change your whole life for me. Change it because it's what you need. We'll figure out the rest. What if the life I need includes you? Preston asked. Then we'll be very lucky, Grace said simply. They stayed in the garden until the candles burned low, then walked together to Preston's room. At the door, Grace hesitated. I should go, she said, though she made no move to leave. You should, Preston agreed, but I really hope you don't. Grace smiled, took his hand, and stepped inside. The next morning, Preston packed his single suitcase and loaded it into his Mercedes SUV with a heavy heart. The other guests had said their goodbyes at breakfast, but Grace walked him out to the parking area alone. 2 weeks, she said, hands linked with his. That's nothing. We can do 2 weeks. I'm going to call you every day, Preston said. Maybe twice a day. Is that too much? It's perfect, Grace assured him. She reached up and kissed him softly. Drive safe. Text me when you get home. And Preston, thank you for being brave enough to come here and do the work. Thank you for seeing me, Preston said. The real me, not just the CEO performance. He kissed her once more, then forced himself to get into the car. As he drove down the winding dirt road, he watched Grace in his rearview mirror until the trees blocked his view. The drive back to Denver felt longer than the drive up had 2 weeks earlier, and Preston's chest ached with missing someone he'd only really known for days. But underneath the ache was something else. Excitement, hope, a sense that his life was finally expanding into something real and full rather than narrow and defended. The meditation practice had cracked him open, and Grace had stepped into that opening, showing him what was possible when he stopped running. Back in Seattle, Preston walked into his office building like a stranger entering a foreign country. Everything looked the same but felt different. His assistant jumped up when she saw him, clearly expecting him to dive immediately back into crisis mode. Instead, Preston smiled and asked how she was, actually listening to the answer. Clear my calendar for tomorrow, he told her. I need a long meeting with Anna, and I don't want it interrupted. The conversation with his COO was one of the hardest Preston had ever had. Anna listened as he explained his realization about control, about running from grief, about needing to restructure his role. He watched her face carefully, terrified she'd be insulted or worried about the company's future. Instead, Anna started laughing. Preston, I've been waiting for you to have this conversation for 3 years. You're brilliant at vision and strategy, but you're terrible at letting go. If you're finally ready to trust me and the team to execute while you focus on the big picture, I'm more than ready. Just like that, Preston said, stunned. Just like that. Though I'm curious what prompted this sudden clarity. Preston found himself telling her about the retreat, about Grace, about Emily and the garden conversation that had unlocked everything. Anna listened with the focused intelligence that made her such an effective leader. Sounds like you met someone extraordinary, Anna said. When do I get to meet her? 2 weeks, if all goes well. I'm hoping to convince her that Seattle has some redeeming qualities. Over those 2 weeks, Preston and Grace talked every single day, sometimes for hours. They video chatted at night, Preston from his downtown condo with the city spread out behind him, Grace from her small cabin on the retreat center property with the forest visible through her windows. They texted about mundane things and deep things, sharing their days and their thoughts and slowly building a foundation. Preston worked with Anna to restructure his role, stepping back from daily operations and focusing on quarterly strategy and key partnerships. He also started seeing a therapist to work through his grief about Emily, something he'd avoided for 20 years. And he kept up the meditation practice, even though it was harder without Grace's guidance and the retreat structure. But he'd sit on his cushion each morning and remember her voice, her presence, and find his way back to his breath. When Grace finally arrived in Seattle, Preston was waiting at the airport with his heart in his throat. He spotted her coming through the gate, looking slightly out of place in her simple clothes among the business travelers and city dwellers. Then she saw him and her face lit up with a smile that made everything else disappear. "Hi," she said, dropping her bag and stepping into his arms. "Hi yourself," Preston said, breathing in the familiar herbal scent of her hair. "God, I missed you." 2 weeks felt like 2 years, Grace admitted. Preston showed her his world over the next few days, his condo with its view of Elliott Bay, his favorite coffee shop where the barista knew his order, the office where Anders Medical Solutions occupied 3 floors of a downtown high-rise. Grace met Anna and several key team members, charming everyone with her warmth and genuine interest. But Preston also showed her the Seattle he was discovering through new eyes. They hiked in Discovery Park, visited Pike Place Market at dawn when the fishmongers were just setting up, took the ferry to Bainbridge Island and walked through the quiet town, holding hands and dreaming aloud about what a life together might look like. "I love it here," Grace said on her last evening, as they sat on Preston's balcony watching the sun set over the water. "It's different from the mountains, but it has its own energy. I could see myself here, at least part of the time." Preston's heart leaped. "Part of the time? I can't leave the retreat center entirely. It's my home, my work, my community. But Preston, I've been thinking, what if I taught here part of the year? There are studios, corporate wellness programs, people who need what I offer. And I could go back to Colorado for the summer programs when the retreat is busiest. We'd be long distance sometimes, but we'd also have real time together. Are you serious?" Preston asked, almost afraid to believe it. "I wouldn't say it if I wasn't. These 2 weeks have confirmed what I already knew. I love you. I want to build a life with you, and I'm willing to get creative about what that life looks like." Preston pulled her close, overcome with gratitude and wonder. "I love you so much. And yes, whatever creative structure we need to make this work, I'm in. All in." They spent Grace's last night making love and making plans, laughing and being serious in turns. Preston felt like he'd found the missing piece of himself, the part that had been locked away since Emily died. Grace had taught him how to be present with difficult feelings rather than running from them, and in doing so, she taught him how to actually live. Over the next year, they built their life together in pieces that gradually formed a whole. Grace spent fall and winter in Seattle, teaching at 2 meditation studios and developing a corporate program that brought mindfulness practices to healthcare workers dealing with burnout. Preston loved having her in his space, loved coming home to find her cooking dinner, or sitting on the balcony with a book, or simply waiting for him with open arms. In spring and summer, Grace returned to Colorado for the retreat season, and Preston visited every chance he got. He became a familiar presence at the center, even co-teaching some sessions with Grace as his own practice deepened. The balance wasn't perfect, but it worked. They both had purpose and autonomy, but they also had each other. 18 months after they met, Preston proposed in the garden where they'd first really connected. He'd flown to Colorado for a long weekend, ostensibly to help with some retreat center repairs. Instead, he'd worked with the staff to prepare the garden, stringing lights and filling it with the kind of late summer flowers Grace loved. When he led her there at sunset, she gasped at the transformation. Then she saw Preston kneeling, ring box open, eyes shining with love and nervousness. "Grace Calloway, you taught me how to breathe, how to be present, how to stop running from the parts of myself I was afraid of. You showed me what love looks like when it's healthy and real. Will you marry me?" Grace was crying and laughing at the same time. "Yes, yes, absolutely yes." The ring was simple, a single sapphire the color of the Colorado sky, and it fit perfectly. They held each other in the garden as stars emerged overhead, both marveling at the unlikely path that had brought them together. They married a year later in a ceremony that honored both their worlds. The wedding was held at the retreat center, with 100 guests including Preston's team from Anders Medical Solutions, Grace's family from Oregon, and all the people whose lives they'd touched along the way. Anna served as Preston's best woman, and Grace's sister stood beside her. The ceremony was led by Grace's meditation teacher from Thailand, who'd flown in to bless the union. Preston cried when he saw Grace walking toward him in a simple ivory dress, carrying wildflowers from the mountain meadows. She was so beautiful it hurt, but more than that, she was his. The woman who'd cracked him open and taught him how to live fully. "I used to think peace was something you achieved," Preston said in his vows. "A destination you reached if you just worked hard enough and controlled enough variables. But you taught me that peace is a practice, something you return to again and again. And Grace, you are my peace. Not because you fixed me or solved my problems, but because you taught me how to be with myself, all of myself, including the broken parts. I promise to practice that every day. To show up fully, to be present with whatever comes, and to love you with everything I have." Grace's vows were equally heartfelt, speaking of courage and vulnerability and the unexpected gifts that arrive when we're open to them. By the end, there wasn't a dry eye in the gathering. The reception was joyful and relaxed, with music and dancing and food that reflected both Seattle's culinary scene and Colorado's local harvest. Preston danced with his new wife under the stars, feeling more complete than he'd ever imagined possible. 2 years into their marriage, Grace got pregnant. It was unexpected but wanted, and Preston found himself terrified and elated in equal measure. The idea of being responsible for a child after losing Emily brought up every fear he'd worked so hard to process. "I'm scared I won't be able to protect them," he admitted to Grace one night as they lay in bed, his hand on her growing belly. "That I'll fail them the way I failed Emily." "You didn't fail Emily," Grace said firmly. "Her death was a tragic accident caused by a system failure, not by you. And our child will be their own person with their own path. We can love them fiercely and teach them well and still not be able to prevent every hurt or loss. That's part of being human." "How are you not terrified?" Preston asked. "Oh, I'm terrified," Grace said with a laugh. "I'm just also excited. We're going to mess this up sometimes, Preston. We'll make mistakes and have to apologize and figure it out as we go. But we'll do it together, and we'll do it with presence and love, and that's enough." Their daughter was born on a spring morning in Seattle, arriving with a lusty cry that announced her presence to the world. They named her Emily Grace Anders, honoring both the sister Preston had lost and the wife who taught him how to live again. When they placed her in Preston's arms for the first time, he wept with joy and grief and overwhelming love. "Hi, little one," he whispered. I'm your dad, and I promise to do my best by you. I promise to show up, to be present, to love you fiercely while also letting you be yourself. And I promise to teach you about your Aunt Emily, about how much she would have loved you." Grace watched from the hospital bed with tears streaming down her face. She's perfect. We're perfect. Life with a baby was chaotic and exhausting and more beautiful than Preston could have imagined. He cut his work hours even further, wanting to be present for the late-night feedings and the first smiles and all the small miracles of his daughter's development. Grace continued teaching part-time, though she streamlined her Colorado commitments to focus more on their growing family. They moved from Preston's condo to a house with a yard, somewhere Emily Grace could run and play. Preston built a small meditation space in the garden, where he still practiced most mornings, now sometimes with his daughter babbling nearby or Grace sitting beside him. The practice had become as essential as breathing, a way of returning to himself and his values no matter what chaos swirled around him. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Preston and Grace returned to the retreat center for a week, leaving Emily Grace with Grace's parents. It felt strange to be back without the responsibility of their daughter, but also necessary. They needed time to reconnect as a couple, to remember who they were beyond being parents. They hiked to the pool where they'd first kissed, and Preston was flooded with memories of that evening, of the terrifying vulnerability of admitting his feelings. "You ever regret it?" he asked Grace, as they sat on the same rocks where they'd sat 5 years earlier. "Giving up the life you had here to build something with me?" Grace turned to him with an expression of such love and contentment that Preston felt it like a physical warmth. "Not for a single second. Preston, you didn't take me away from my life. You expanded it. I still teach, still practice, still have this place to return to. But I also have you and Emily Grace and a richness I never would have found if I'd stayed safe and small." "I think about that day in the garden sometimes," Preston said. "When I told you about Emily, about trying to make the world perfect enough that I'd never lose anyone again, you helped me see how impossible and destructive that was. But I still struggle with it, especially now that we have a daughter. The fear comes up." "Of course it does," Grace said. "That's not something you solve once and for all. It's something you practice with. You notice the fear, you feel it without letting it dictate your actions, and you return to the present moment where everything is actually okay. You've gotten so much better at that." "Because you taught me how," Preston said. "You're still teaching me how." They made love that evening in the cabin Grace used to live in, now occupied by a new teacher. It felt like closing a circle, returning to where they'd started but as different people than they'd been then. More whole. More real. When they returned home to Seattle, Emily Grace ran to them on wobbly toddler legs, shouting "Mama, Dada," with uninhibited joy. Preston scooped her up and held her tight, breathing in her baby shampoo smell and feeling his heart expand impossibly further. This was what mattered. Not board meetings or acquisition deals, or making his company even more successful than it already was. Not even the meditation practice, though that was part of it. What mattered was showing up fully for the people he loved, being present with whatever arose, and building a life that honored both the grief of the past and the joy of the present. Years passed in the beautiful, ordinary way that lives unfold when you're paying attention. Emily Grace grew into a curious, spirited child who loved both the mountains of Colorado and the water of Seattle. She'd spend summers at the retreat center, following her mother around the garden and charming all the guests with her questions and observations. In Seattle, she attended a school Preston and Grace carefully selected for its emphasis on mindfulness and emotional intelligence. Preston continued to guide Anders' medical solutions, but increasingly from a strategic rather than operational role. The company thrived, saving countless lives through its systems, and Preston felt genuine pride in that legacy. But it no longer defined him. He was a husband, a father, a meditation practitioner, a photographer who'd returned to his art. He was a man who'd learned to live broadly rather than narrowly, to embrace uncertainty rather than trying to control everything. Grace expanded her teaching, writing a book about mindfulness for healthcare professionals that became a surprise bestseller. She traveled occasionally to lead workshops and retreats, but always with the agreement that family came first. The balance they'd created wasn't static. It required constant adjustment and communication, but both were committed to it. On the 10th anniversary of the day Preston had first arrived at the retreat center, they threw a party in their Seattle home. Friends and family filled the house and spilled into the garden. Emily Grace, now 7, played with other children, her laughter ringing out clear and bright. Anna was there with her family. Grace's parents, Robert and his wife from that first retreat who'd become dear friends, even Preston's old therapist who'd helped him work through so much grief. Preston stood on the deck, watching it all with a glass of wine in hand, and felt Grace's arms slip around him from behind. "What are you thinking?" she asked, resting her chin on his shoulder. "That I almost missed this," Preston said. "If I hadn't listened to my body screaming at me to change something, if I hadn't been desperate enough to try meditation, if I hadn't been brave enough to tell you how I felt that night by the pool, I might have missed all of this." "But you didn't," Grace said. "You were brave. You listened. You changed." "We changed each other," Preston corrected. He turned in her arms to face her. "I turned you into a part-time city dweller, made your life more complicated," Grace laughed. "And I turned you into someone who meditates and gardens and actually takes time off." "Made your life more complicated too. But Preston, look at what we built. Look at our daughter, our friends, this life. Complications and all, I wouldn't change a thing." Emily Grace ran up to them at that moment, throwing her arms around both their legs. "Can we do the gratitude circle like at the center?" she asked. "Please." Preston and Grace exchanged smiles. It had become a tradition in their family, borrowed from the retreat center. Before bed each night, they'd share one thing they were grateful for from the day. "I think that's a perfect idea," Grace said. "Let's gather everyone." They called the party guests into a large circle in the garden, lit by string lights and candles. It took a moment for everyone to settle, but Grace's calm presence gradually brought the group to quiet attention. "We're going to do something my family does every night," Emily Grace announced with the confidence of a child who'd grown up straddling two worlds. "Everyone shares one thing they're grateful for. Who wants to start?" Robert raised his hand. "I'm grateful for this family who welcomed an old man and his wife into their lives and never let go." The gratitude moved around the circle. Anna was grateful for a boss who'd become a friend and taught her that success didn't require sacrifice. Grace's mother was grateful for seeing her daughter find such profound happiness. The children were grateful for cake and games and friends. When it came to Grace, she looked at Preston with shining eyes. "I'm grateful for the moment 10 years ago when a stubborn, wounded CEO walked into my retreat center and was brave enough to do the work. I'm grateful for every single day since then, even the hard ones. Especially the hard ones, because they taught us how strong we are together." Preston felt his throat tighten. When all eyes turned to him, he took a moment to compose himself. "I'm grateful for a life I never could have imagined," he said. "For my wife who taught me that peace isn't something you achieve but something you practice. For my daughter who reminds me every day what really matters. For my sister Emily, whose death broke me open enough that love could eventually find its way in." His voice cracked, but he pushed through. And I'm grateful for all of you, for being part of this extraordinary, messy, beautiful life. Emily Grace hugged him tight. "Don't cry, Daddy. These are happy tears, sweetheart," Preston assured her. "Sometimes joy is so big it has to leak out." The party continued until late, filled with laughter and music, and the kind of deep contentment that comes from being exactly where you're supposed to be. After everyone left and Emily Grace was finally, reluctantly, tucked into bed, Preston and Grace stood in their garden under the stars. "Do you remember what you said that first night at the retreat?" Grace asked. "When I asked what made you choose healthcare technology, I said I was trying to make sure what happened to Emily couldn't happen to anyone else," Preston replied. "And you did that. You really did. But you also did something equally important." Grace took his hand. "You learned how to stop running from loss and grief. You learned how to be present with pain without letting it consume you. And in doing that, you made space for all this joy." Preston pulled her close, his wife, his teacher, his love. "I couldn't have done it without you. You would have found your way eventually," Grace said, "but I'm glad I got to be part of the journey." They stood together in silence, breathing in sync, present with each other and the moment and the life they'd built. Preston thought about the man he'd been 10 years ago, driving up that dirt road with his chest tight and his mind racing, convinced that peace was impossible, that love was a luxury he couldn't afford, that the only way to honor his sister's memory was to work himself to death. That man felt like a stranger now. Preston had learned to breathe. He'd learned to be still. He'd learned that the peace he sought wasn't waiting for him at the end of some impossible journey of perfection. It was here, in the messy middle of a fully lived life, in his daughter's laughter, in his wife's arms, in the moment when he noticed he was anxious and gently, without judgment, returned his attention to his breath, in the garden where things grew and died and grew again in their own time. The CEO had gone to a meditation retreat, and the instructor had indeed made him want to find peace in her arms. But more than that, she'd taught him how to find peace within himself, and that had made all the difference. Years later, when Emily Grace was 16 and applying to colleges, she asked Preston about the retreat center. "Is it true you and Mom met there?" she asked over dinner one night. "It is," Preston confirmed. "I was a mess. Your mom put me back together." "That's not quite how it happened," Grace interjected with a smile. "Your dad did the hard work himself. I just held space for it. But you fell in love there," Emily Grace pressed. "Like in 2 weeks." Preston and Grace exchanged a look, the kind of wordless communication that came from years of partnership. "Sometimes you meet someone and you just know," Preston said. "Not in some magical fairy tale way, but in a deep, grounded way. Your mom was exactly who I needed to meet when I needed to meet her, and I'd like to think I was the same for her." "You were," Grace said softly. "You absolutely were." Emily Grace smiled. "I hope I find something like that someday, someone who sees me and isn't scared of my mess." "You will," Preston assured her. "And when you do, remember what your mom taught me. Don't run from the hard stuff. Don't try to be perfect. Just show up honestly and see what happens. Also, don't wait until you're dying from stress to deal with your issues," Grace added with a laugh. "Learn from your father's mistakes on that front." They all laughed, the easy laughter of a family that knew each other deeply and loved each other fully. Preston looked at his daughter, this beautiful, complicated young woman who carried both Emily's name and Grace's wisdom, and felt such profound gratitude it was almost overwhelming. He'd set out to build a company that saved lives. He had done that, and it mattered. But sitting here with his wife and daughter in this moment of ordinary domestic joy, Preston knew this was his greatest achievement, not the billions in his company's valuation, not the awards or recognition, but this, love, presence. A life lived fully and consciously, with all its pain and beauty embraced rather than avoided. The CEO had gone to a meditation retreat seeking stress relief. He'd found so much more. He'd found himself. He'd found love. He'd found peace, not as a destination but as a practice, something he returned to again and again, sometimes in Grace's arms but increasingly within himself. And every single day, he was grateful he'd been brave enough to take that first step up that dirt road into the mountains, toward a teacher and a teaching that would transform everything. The journey had been worth it. The destination was still unfolding. And Preston Anders, husband, father, CEO, and perpetual student of presence, couldn't wait to see what came next.